Microsoft charges customers licensing fees based on use of its products. The greater the use, the more you pay. Are Microsoft's measures of use consistent across all the company's products? The answer is it depends on what you mean by consistent. Do related Microsoft products always, for licensing purposes, measure use the same way? No. But do all Microsoft products draw from the same small set of general measurement categories? Yes, they do. And in fact, there are four such categories. Each has their own unique characteristics like cost predictability, compliance challenges, and associated vocabulary. Once you understand these categories and their characteristics, you will have a huge head start understanding the licensing for most any Microsoft product. Welcome to the Introduction to Microsoft Licensing series. Each episode explains fundamental licensing concepts applicable across all Microsoft products. The goal: help procurement and IT professionals get up to speed more quickly so they can make smarter licensing decisions for their organization. My name is Rob Horwitz. I am co-founder of an independent consultancy called Directions on Microsoft, and I'm one of the presenters at our multi-day Microsoft licensing boot camps. Today's episode is Units of Measure. Microsoft uses four categories of metrics to assess fees: per user, per device, capacity-based, and consumption-based. Spoiler alert, the last two might sound the same, but they are not. You can think of this list as four different ways for Microsoft to assess a tax. And I'm sure all of you have firsthand experience with taxes, so when I discuss each of Microsoft's four metrics, I'll give you a parallel government tax or fee example to help illustrate the point. Okay, so let's get started with the four different ways Microsoft taxes you for use of their products. First up, per user. Per user licenses are sold per individual person. And when I say individual person, I mean an actual human being. A per user license provides the right for that individual person to use a Microsoft product, typically from any PC, tablet, smartphone, or other client device. Also, I should mention that throughout this presentation, I'll mimic Microsoft and interchange the words access and use because they essentially mean the same thing. I promise to give you government tax and fee analogies. An obvious one here is a fee for a driver's license or a passport. That's the per user license, and it even has a person's picture on it. So what are the most common types of Microsoft per user licenses that you'll encounter? User subscription licenses and user client access licenses. Thankfully, they are not difficult to identify. Both have the word user and license in their names. First up, user subscription licenses, often called user SLs. User subscription licenses are most often associated with online services, such as Microsoft 365 suites and all its subcomponents, such as Exchange Online, if purchased separately. Next up are user client access licenses, often called user CALs. User CALs are associated with traditional server software products like Exchange Server for email and scheduling, and SharePoint Server, which provides document libraries, among other things. Yes, Exchange Server and SharePoint Server are slowly being replaced by their online counterparts, Exchange Online and SharePoint Online, but these two server application products are still around. A user CAL bestows the right on an individual to, quote, access, or in other words, receive data from or provide data to these server products. That's it for our first metric type, per user. Now on to the second type, per device. Per device licenses are priced per physical device. And by physical device, I mean either a client device like a PC or server hardware. Sticking with the government fee analogy, a per device license is akin to your auto registration fee. That fee is associated with a device, your car. What are the major types of per device licenses that you'll encounter? There are 3. First are per device licenses that cover use of server software running on the server hardware. These licenses provide the right for a physical server to run Microsoft server software. For example, there exists a server license for Exchange Server and a server license for SharePoint Server. If you're curious, in the case of both of these server products, a single server license covers running one instance of the server software on one physical server, regardless of the server hardware attributes like processor type. That's a good segue into the second class of per-device licenses, which are device client access licenses, usually shortened to device CALs. We already mentioned that there are user CALs associated with traditional server products like Exchange Server and SharePoint Server, but Microsoft also offers a device CAL option. In scenarios involving large groups of users sharing a limited number of devices, for example, kiosks at an airport, device CALs can make a lot more financial sense than user CALs. As you see from this illustration at the right, there are 2 very different classes of per-device licenses involved with products like Exchange Server. One class of per-device license for the server, and a different class for each client device used to access it. And not surprisingly, each server license is a lot more expensive, but the CALs are much more numerous. And for the third class of per-device license, we have device subscription licenses, usually called device SLs. Device subscription licenses are not super common, but when they are an option, they most often are associated with online services. So for example, Dynamics 365 branded online services give customers a choice whether to cover some forms of access via a device SL instead of a user SL, with device SL making a lot more sense in scenarios such as a call center, for example. So far, we explained the basics of how per user and per device licensing metrics work. It turns out per user and per device licensing raise some common general concerns, so I'll take a few moments to outline what to look out for. And after that, we'll get on with the discussion of capacity and consumption-based metrics. What should you be on the lookout for with respect to per user and per device licenses? The first thing to look out for, compliance tools. Don't assume that Microsoft products licensed per user or per device have built-in systems to confirm the proper type and quantity of per user and per device licenses have been purchased. Within the Microsoft product ecosystem, there are examples where license compliance for user and device-based licenses are built in, examples where it is partially built in, and examples where it is not built in at all, where the door is left wide open. And when license compliance is partial or simply not built in, then figuring out how to assure license compliance is your responsibility, meaning there is a potential legal and financial risk should your organization be audited by Microsoft's minions. So have some plan to deal with license compliance if it's not built in. One conceivable plan, at least for large customers, is to ask Microsoft for an indulgence of sorts ahead of time as part of contract negotiations. The second thing you need to look out for with per user and per device licensing is Special exception cases. Sometimes there are circumstances when use of a Microsoft product is free, in other words, doesn't require a user or device license. Sometimes there are situations where use can be covered using an alternative, lower cost license type. While these exceptions are not very common, you want to exploit them when they do exist. For example, sometimes Microsoft provides special licensing exceptions for use of your Microsoft product deployments by people not under your direct employ, such as outside contractors. So be on the lookout for special exceptions. The third thing to look out for with per user and per device licensing, have a defined process for identifying and repurposing unused licenses. Per user and per device license subscriptions last anywhere from a month to several years in duration. So if a user leaves the organization or if you retire a device, you'll likely want to repurpose that subscription license. A good example is repurposing an ex-employee's Microsoft 365 Suite subscription license by reassigning it to a new employee. However, be warned that doing this in a way that preserves the ex-employee's email and other important data requires that administrators follow a disciplined multi-step process. The fourth thing to look out for with per user and per device licensing, be careful when interpreting pricing. For example, user subscription licenses and device subscription licenses are usually quoted per user per month or per device per month, but not always. Be especially careful when comparing quotes through different Microsoft licensing programs. Be certain you are doing an apples to apples comparison. For example, take a quote for the per month cost of some user SL. The enterprise agreement price quote and a Microsoft customer agreement price quote could be predicated on very different subscription commitment durations. For example, one prohibiting cancellation for a year and the other allowing cancellation at the end of any month. So for per user and per device licenses, take the time to understand the nature of the price quoted. Okay, enough about per user and per device licensing. Let's move on to capacity and consumption-based licensing. Here we go on capacity-based. Capacity-based licensing provides the right to use a product or service up to a specified resource capacity limit, with the amount charged unaffected by how much capacity is used. In other words, you pay for it whether or not you use it. Typically, there's a period of time associated with the capacity. So in this picture, think about renting a specific size shipping container on a month-to-month basis. Sticking with the government tax and fee analogies, everyone loves taxes and fees, right? I'll go with real estate taxes for a house in a place that gets very cold during the winter, like upstate New York. The house represents a capacity, a space where a small group of people can live. However, let's say you go to Florida in the winter months. Do you get a discount on your New York property taxes to account for the time you're not in New York? Of course not. What about some examples of Microsoft products licensed by capacity? The first capacity-based licenses Microsoft introduced were for two server software products, Windows Server and SQL Server. For these two products, Microsoft measures capacity based on the number of cores within the physical server's computer processor chips. Today's processors have many cores, with the cores akin to cylinders in an internal combustion engine. As a general rule, the more cores, the more computational capacity. So the capacity-based fee for running Windows Server or SQL Server on server hardware is in the form of core licenses. Today, capacity-based licensing is most widely used with online services, and capacity metrics vary depending on the specific service. Some metrics are straightforward. For example, Azure Virtual Machine capacity covers use of a specific number of cores and memory on a particular chip architecture, along with some temporary storage. In the case of Azure VMs, the exact license naming changes a bit based on the capacity commitment duration, with pay-as-you-go essentially meaning no upfront commitment, and reservation meaning a capacity commitment duration of 1 or more years. Now, not all capacity metrics are as transparent as is the case with Azure virtual machines. Some are difficult to translate into the capacity size you think you'll need. So far, we covered per user, per device, and capacity, and now we'll move on to the fourth and final category, consumption-based licenses. Consumption-based licenses provide the right to use a service with charges based on how much of it is used. In this illustration, the electric meter only moves when devices or systems are drawing electric current. And when electric current is being drawn, some real work is being done, whether it be lights are on, there's heating or cooling, there's computers being powered, or whatever. Sticking with the government tax and fee analogy, consumption-based licenses are like a sales tax, or if you're outside the USA, like a VAT, a value-added tax. No tax is assessed until you consume. What are some examples in the Microsoft ecosystem? Consumption is oftentimes used for Microsoft Azure branded services. For example, Azure SQL Database offers a deployment option called serverless. What does serverless mean? Serverless means no compute-related charges are assessed until Azure SQL Database wakes up in response to an incoming query, then processes a query, and then goes back to sleep. In other words, you're not charged for the time the database is sleeping on the job. However, consumption-based licensing isn't just for things branded Azure. For example, within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, there is a Power Apps license type described as pay-as-you-go. For these pay-as-you-go licenses, consumption-based means a charge is triggered only if a user seeks out and runs a particular application inside the Power Apps environment. The consumption being measured is a number of unique users in any given calendar month. So as with capacity-based licenses, the metric used to assess consumption-based fees vary depending on the service, and in some cases can be quite complex. Now that we know the basics about capacity and consumption-based licensing and how it works, let's talk about some things to look out for. And thankfully, license compliance is not on the list. Putting aside a few corner cases, such as some dev test scenarios, license compliance enforcement is generally built in when it comes to online services licensed by capacity consumption. So what is on the what to look out for list? Well, what comes next is a discussion of 2 items applicable to both capacity and consumption, 2 specific to just capacity, and 2 specific to consumption. I want to emphasize that what comes next is not just relevant to procurement professionals, but also to IT technical folks as well. Why? Because these licensing considerations can absolutely impact how you choose to architect IT systems built on Microsoft technology. What should you be on the lookout with both capacity and consumption licensing? First is that each product employs its own product-specific capacity or consumption measure, and sometimes the formulas are obtuse. Now add in the fact that workloads might involve multiple distinct, as in separately charged services, each with their own nuances. So things could get to the point where test deployments are required just to determine the capacity or consumption requirements of a particular workload. Yes, it might well be the case that the only way to have an accurate idea of how much a cloud workload costs to run is to run it and get the bill. Another thing to look out for with capacity and consumption-based licensing is that some online services give customers a choice between the two. In other cases, when you might have a choice between capacity and consumption, It might involve moving to a different service that performs a similar type function. Take, for example, data storage. Some forms of Azure data storage are capacity based, meaning you're billed monthly for the provision maximum capacity, not the actual size of the data. Other forms of data storage are consumption based, where you are charged by the actual size of the data as it expands and contracts over time. Next up, two items to look out for specific to capacity-based licensing. Both relate to your capacity size choice. First, if you commit to a bigger capacity than required, you generate unnecessary licensing expense. In other words, waste. Then there's the converse, the risk of undersizing. Make sure you have a clear understanding of what happens when capacity is exhausted. Absent intervention, does a service throttle down, degrade, or seize up as it approaches empty? Or does it automatically start levying charges on top of the initial capacity charge, the way that a cell phone data plan might when you exceed the plan's monthly data download capacity? You need to know these types of things to have any hope of meeting cost and performance expectations. And finally, two items to look out for specific to consumption-based licensing. First, understand how to press the pause or shut off button so consumption charges cease to accrue. The process for doing this can vary widely by product and may involve multiple steps. Second, consider automating spending limits or at least setting up alerts. Typically, products licensed by consumption lack any built-in barriers or restraints and will let you consume away until your heart's content. Fortunately, there are tools in the Azure ecosystem that allow you to set up an automated alert when costs exceed a certain threshold. But that is something you have to set up on your own. And now for a recap. We went through the four general metrics Microsoft uses as a basis for their fees: per user, per device, capacity-based, and consumption-based. You now understand how each works, along with the potential benefits and pitfalls. So when you are tasked to research how product XYZ is licensed, you have a considerable head start. Use the what to look out for checklist we've enumerated to guide you in your research. Let's end with one consistent analogy to illustrate all four different measures we've discussed. Since you're probably sick of taxes by now, the analogy I'll use next is a gym. Think of a bunch of weights. Per user works like a gym membership, where each member pays a monthly fee and has a picture ID card. That member ID allows that one person to use the facilities whenever they want, but does not cover use of the gym by others, such as friends or family members. Think of per device like home gym equipment. You buy it, and anyone you allow can use it. Capacity-based is like an add-on to your gym membership that allows you to use the facility's swimming pool whenever you want. But you still must pay even if you don't end up using the swimming pool. Consumption-based is how a high-end gym or health club might handle massage sessions. You're charged a per-instance massage fee only after you show up for and receive the service. As you can see from our gym analogy, your overall gym fees might be based on multiple measurements. For example, per user-based membership fee plus a capacity-based add-on for use of the swimming pool. So be on the lookout for the same kind of thing with Microsoft products. Oftentimes there are multiple forms of taxes that impact your overall licensing cost for a product. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Microsoft Licensing Basics. If your job includes making decisions about Microsoft licensing, we, as in Directions on Microsoft, can help. Our online Microsoft licensing reference set, provides easy to understand explanations and illustrations of the licensing rules for hundreds of Microsoft products and cloud services. Our 3-day Microsoft licensing boot camps are the fastest way to get the knowledge and understanding you need to make smarter decisions that keep your company compliant without overbuying. And finally, our Microsoft licensing advisory services put the entire team of Directions on Microsoft negotiation and licensing experts on your side of the table to optimize the results of your next Microsoft contract negotiation.